Good afternoon, everyone. So I am Christine Beherasco. As Jaakko mentioned, I lead the Tactical Defence Unit in F-Securen. And today, I'm going to be looking at some highlights from the threat landscape that we have seen from the second half of last year up until the first half of this year. And I also have some information even as fresh as this morning. So hang in there. So let's start with distribution methods. And what I'm talking about are infection vectors. So infection vectors are the first part of the infection chain when you get infected with malware. So this is the entry point of malware into the device. And what we have seen was that, firstly, software bundles or cracks. These are the type of infections where the attacker will try to circumvent digital protections in a certain software, or for instance, when you are in these online streaming sites that also tries to circumvent digital protections for movies or TV series, then they try to bundle malware together with legitimate software into a certain application. But that type of threat has been down by around 5% since the second half of last year to the first half of this year. Another type of infection vector are those that are related to exploit kits or malicious advertising. So these are the type of infection vectors that actually needs no execution, needs no activity from the user in order to be installed. So for example, the user yesterday visited a news website that was perfectly clean, and today that news website started to host a malicious advertising. So it could happen that even without changing the user's activities, they could get malware today from that malicious advertising. But the good thing about this is that this type of infection vector hasn't really changed too much. So this has stayed roughly the same, maybe a point tick moving downwards. And then another infection vector are these manually installed payloads or second stage payloads. Now there's two things that I'm lumping together here. So manually installed payload means that there's an attacker that is on the other side trying to infiltrate, let's say, an organization or a device to install a payload. So a very common example of this today is that open RDP ports that are exposed to the internet that are being used by the bad guys in order to infiltrate the network. And once they get in, they move from one device to another through a method called lateral movement. And then once they find the device where they want to install the malware, then they deploy the payload there. So that's manual installation of payloads. And then there's also the part where we install second stage payloads, which means that there is a first stage payload which tries to install itself first, and then secondly, it will pull a malware from perhaps the internet and then install it on the device as well. So these are the two different types of infections that are lumped together here, and this is up 11 points from last year up until this year. And then finally, we have emails. So emails need no explanation, but email so far this year has been half of all the infection vectors that we have seen. And this is helped in part by the coronavirus pandemic. So the COVID pandemic, especially this year, we have seen that there were so many emails that were floating around that were using this theme. And if you actually look at it, at least in my career, 17 years in this industry, I haven't seen so much different malware families rally under a singular theme that they have been using up until this COVID-19 pandemic. And if you look at this trend here, so there has been an uptick of email threats that have been using COVID themes during the first half of this year up until May, up until early June, and it looks like it tapered down. But just like it appears that there's a second wave of infection happening globally, there seems to be also a second wave, an uptick of all these COVID-related themes that's happening out there. So we can see that threats are definitely very opportunistic. What they try to do is whenever there is a type of activity, an event, or something truly global, such as the pandemic that is happening today, they will ride on that wave and they will use that so that they can get as much eyeballs as possible into their emails, and then give it a greater chance of being clicked and executed in the victim's device. Now, let's take a closer look at the top 5 threats that is coming in via emails today. So the first one that we can see here is Lockybot, which is an info stealer. Now, Lockybot is not very new, but it has been rising in popularity as well. And Lockybot is able to get your passwords from the browsers, log keystrokes, for instance, and then also steal cryptocurrency wallets. And then the next one that we can see is Emotet. Now, Emotet is a malware that is an installer of second-stage payloads. So this is what we call a malware distributor. And it has stayed like roughly at the same level. And the third one that we have here is Formbook, which is also an info stealer. So true to its name, what it does is that it grabs information from web forms. So for example, when you visit a banking site, you input information there, and then you send that to the server. What Formbook does is that it grabs that information as well and sends that to a remote command and control server, sends it to the attacker. And then we also have Remcos, which is a remote access Trojan. And remote access Trojan typically gives the attacker the capability to control the remote machine. And once they do that, Remcos also has the capability, like the other info stealers, to log keystrokes. And then finally, we have Ave Maria. So Ave Maria is a newcomer into the top 5 malware spam threats. And Ave Maria is also a fast-rising info stealer, which, like the others, also has the capability to steal browser credentials, among others. Here's an example of how an email threat would look like, a malspam email. And if you can actually take a look closer, so the text is a little bit small, but if you look a little bit closer, the topic is COVID-19 related. But the attachments, if you see them, they have different file extensions. And these are file extensions of archives. But they are not your typical archives. They're not your zip or your RAR archives. You have gzip and you have ACE archives in here. These are actually quite obscure because historically, what has happened with malware is that initially they were attaching executables into the emails. But the email gateways thought that, okay, normal people don't attach executables to their emails, so let's block all those emails at the gateway. So what the bad guys did was that, okay, let's put the executables inside the zip and the RAR files. And so what the email gateway scanners did was like, okay, let's start parsing inside the zip and the RAR files. And so we still managed to catch the executables. But now, if you have all of these different archive formats, it becomes more challenging to try to parse all of them. So this is kind of like a cat and mouse game that has been happening over and over again. And even nowadays, what has been happening is the bad guys are using documents or PDFs. And normal people, like ordinary people in the business community, they attach documents and PDFs in their emails. So you can't really block those things from the gateway. So the threat actors, they try to keep on evolving in order to also ensure that they can still deliver their wares even if we elevate the state of our protection. Although those 5 threats earlier, the top 5 malspam threats, are quite interesting, let's take a look at Emotet, because Emotet last month, Traficom has been issuing an advisory that Emotet has been rising in Finland. And this is a screenshot that I got this morning related to an email that has been sent by the Emotet malware spam, and it's in Finnish. So definitely Emotet has been ticking up, but this is also coincidental with the global trend that we have been seeing in Emotet. So the graph that you see here is based on our detections that have been available since December 2019 and March 2020, like this year. And we have seen that there has been an uptick of the Emotet malware that have been spreading out in the wild. And Emotet has this kind of behavior where there are times when they have downtimes, but there are also times when they're really massively spamming. And there are times that they may be down for a month and then they come back with a new version. So they keep on evolving as well. So Emotet is actually nothing new. So it has been around since 2014. But initially, it was a banking Trojan. And after heavily spamming for 3 years, it amassed a large enough user base and then realized that perhaps it's time to shift from a B2C model where they try to infect customers directly, not really customers, victims directly, to kind of like a B2B model where they try to sell their ecosystem. They try to sell their botnet to other businesses, other malware actors. And so what happened then was that they were spamming docs, they were spamming PDFs. Whenever those get blocked, they try to spam everything that has archives. They keep on trying to evolve until they can really amass that large of a scale. And when Emotet is installed in the device, what happens is that it contacts the remote command and control server that is owned by the attacker. And after doing that, the attacker can then potentially grab information from the device. It can install other malware into the device, such as, for instance, TrickBot, which you can see here. And TrickBot, on the other hand, kind of like has the same history as Emotet as well, where it was a banking Trojan, but then realized that it's probably more lucrative to partner with Emotet. Because if Emotet already has the reach, then what could be remaining that could be valuable for the other bad guys, for the other threat actors? So understanding the internals of a business network is actually quite valuable. Because, for example, if TrickBot has the capability to profile a device or understand what are the accounts within the device, is it an administrator account? Is it perhaps a domain administrator account? Can they get like higher control, like better control of the network if they get the account of this device? And this is the power behind the Emotet TrickBot combination, where they have the capability to profile the network and then sell it to other threat actors. Ransomware threat actors like Ryok find this very valuable. So Ryok has been quite notorious ever since starting January 2019. And we have seen them have high-profile infections that have been happening globally. And this is one of the ransomware threat actors that also try to exact the highest amount of ransom payments. So this is quite a powerful combination that they are having. And Emotet as well, of course, keeps on evolving itself, try to find new methods of infection, including now using wireless LAN, where it tries to brute force passwords, and then if you manage to get in, then you get an Emotet infection. But enough about Emotet. Other things that we actually see via emails are phishing. Now, sometimes we think that, okay, phishing has been around for so long, it's so ubiquitous, sometimes we brush it off because it sounds so simple. But the nasty thing about phishing is that it's actually a very platform-agnostic threat. So it works on Windows, works on Linux, works on Mac, whatever you have. If you have the ability to click on a URL and that loads in a browser, that could be a way to phish for your information. So what has been happening with businesses recently is that they have also slowly adopted Office 365 in their systems. And because of this, of course, the threat actors understand that, okay, this is another opportunity for us to try to phish for Office 365 credentials. And this is why from the second half of last year up until the first half of this year, this Office 365 phishing has increased by 52%. And if we think that phishing is only for emails, let's think again. Because last week, I got this from my phone, by the way, so these are screenshots from my phone. Last week, I got this message from Posti, supposedly. And recently, I've been ordering maybe a little bit more than the usual from online. I have quite a bit of messages coming from Posti, which is not really on this thread. It's in the real Posti thread. And although my Finnish is actually only enough for grocery shopping, I have a funny feeling that this is coming from Posti because I see the Posti word in there. So if, for example, I believe this and clicked on it, it gives me this supposedly Posti site. And, well, Posti doesn't really charge me for delivery. It just tells me that, okay, pick it up from Arkioski or from Alipa. But this one, let's say I believe that I'm going to pay €1 for delivery, and then I go now to the payment site, which is not really unusual, because whenever we pay we pay using credit cards, it asks us for our personal information as well, including addresses. But for example, let's say I inputted my personal information and believe this. Then, of course, it will also ask for my credit card information. And what happens after this? So what we have typically seen is that most of the time, this information is just lumped together with all other victims and then sold in bulk underground. But for example, if they find, for instance, high-profile targets, those could be used for targeted attacks as well. From phishing to a more targeted type of phishing, which we can call spearfishing. A month ago, we released a paper on the Lazarus Group, which is an advanced persistent threat actor. And the Lazarus Group, as of today, they're targeting the cryptocurrency verticals, so the cryptocurrency businesses. And how they actually start, like their infection vector begins with either a LinkedIn message or perhaps an email. Or it can be anything, because these are targeted threat actors. But what we have seen here are typically in LinkedIn, they mention that, okay, they target a certain person and mention that there's job opening with this job profile, which is, of course, like very much targeted to cryptocurrency job profile. And this is what we call the decoy document. Like in front of you, you can see a job description, but behind the scenes, that document could contain malicious code that tries to connect to a remote location and then download malware into your device. And the Lazarus Group today, they are motivated by financial profit. But of course, these threat actors can just change, and they could be going after a different group tomorrow, a different type of vertical tomorrow. So these are just the motivations that they have for today. So I have now gave you like bits and pieces of different areas that we have seen in the recent threat landscape. Of course, this is not everything, so I would encourage you to actually read our attack landscape white paper that is linked from the F-Secure blog. But before doing that, first, looking back at these threats. So what are we to do? Like with all of this information, all of this news that businesses are actually getting attacked, ransomware is infiltrating their organizations, what can we do within our organizations? So firstly, an ounce of prevention is definitely better than hundreds of thousands of euros in ransom payment. So at the very least, let us try to increase the security posture of our organizations. And this starts by perhaps hiring security consultants in order to understand the organization's security capabilities. And after that, follow what the consultants are actually advising in order to help lessen the attack surface of the organization. And of course, it helps when we look at our employees and try to train them, perform security trainings for them. Because, for example, if our employees are partners in this improvement of our security posture, then they can be the ones to spot that, hey, there's an email with an attachment here, or a URL, and I'm not really expecting it from this person. And perhaps like get them thinking that, why don't I verify this using another channel, like an SMS, if this person has really contacted me? And then let's ensure as well that we don't diminish the capabilities of the security products that are available out there. So endpoint protection products, for instance, they are very good at protecting against threats that are already known. But not only that, they can protect against unknown threats with known behaviors. So a vast majority of the threats that we see out there can just be prevented. It's more costly to clean up your organization's infection rather than just to prevent that infection from happening in the first place. And then secondly, there are weak signals that are actually performed by attackers whenever they try to infiltrate using manual methods into the organization. And this is where detection and response products are very valuable, because these weak signals, you can't block them through EPP, because your EPP is going to cause a lot of false positives. But whenever you have these weak signals, you can stitch them together, and they form an incident story. And once you have the incident story, the risk of these different events actually pushes the incident higher, and then as an organization, you have the capability to respond and then to contain that. Thirdly, ransomware, unfortunately, it strikes fear into the hearts of those who don't have backups, or who may have had their backups encrypted or deleted by an infection. And this is why having backups with revision control is actually quite valuable, and especially if you can get your backups detached from the network after the backup process. And then finally, now that we are mostly working from home, and I know this may be a hard ask, but if we can, separate our work devices and our work activities from our home devices and home activities. Our personal communication channels, we have different ways of communicating, and if we cross-pollinate these things, the threats could easily just cross over from our personal communication channels to our business networks. So let's think of our laptops as extensions of our office, even when we're at home. That's all the information I have for today. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening.